The playroom. The bathroom next to the sauna was entirely white. It had a large shower area at one end with 2 shower heads, and at the other, facing the shower, was a toilet and something the boys had never seen before. On the far wall was a hand basin, a mirror, and another door. When all were inside, Vladimir, ever the inquisitive one, asked the question. "What is that?" pointing to the device next to the toilet. "A bidet," Helen replied. "Do you pee in it?" Vlad continued, noticing that it did not have the usual S-bend of a toilet. "No. It's for washing yourself after you go to the toilet," Helen explained, then added, "Who's first?" "Me. I'm busting." It was Dawn. "If you boys want to watch, you better get over here now," Dawn added, already seated on the toilet, legs spread wide. "Open your pussy so they can see where it comes out," her mother added. The boys scurried to the toilet and squatted next to each of Dawn's knees. She hurriedly reached between her legs and had only just parted her labia when the pee began to gush out. The boys could see the yellow stream exit the tiny hole above Dawn's vagina and splash against the front of the bowl. They sat transfixed as the stream slowed, running down past her vagina and dripping off the ass, until it finally stopped. They continued watching as Dawn took a small piece of toilet paper and patted her pussy dry. "Awesome!" Carl exclaimed, backing out of the way as Dawn stood up. Watching Dawn pee had not done the boys any favor for their own needs. Their cocks, which had slackened a little since the pussy licking, were now totally rigid again. There was no way they would be able to point them into the toilet bowl, sitting or standing. Helen had the solution. "You two can pee in the shower. See if you can piss on the ceiling. It'll wash off." So the boys stood at either side of the shower area, leant back and attempted to pee straight up to hit the ceiling. As expected, by Helen at least, the pee went everywhere, splashing back on themselves and all over the shower. Vlad saw the game in it and deliberately squirted his brother. Carl responded in kind, and soon it was a hose fight with yellow water. By the time they ran out of pee, the boys were wet from head to toe. They stood there, giggling, not knowing what to do next. Leaning against the vanity, Dawn was trying to stifle a belly laugh. Helen rescued the situation by leaning in, grabbing a detachable shower head and hosing the boys down. Just as they would in their own shower at home, the two boys hugged, rigid penises pressed into each other's body. And seemingly oblivious to the other occupants of the room, they kissed. "I still need to pee," said Helen. "You boys can stay there or you can watch. It is up to you. But I should warn you, I need to take a shit as well." "That's okay. We are used to that. Remember?" said Vlad. "We told you in the last session. At home we sit backwards on the toilet so the other one can watch." Carl added. "I can do that now if you want," Helen offered. The two boys shot glances at each other again, not sure whether they had crossed the line. As usual, it was Vlad who took the tough one. "We didn't ask 'cause we thought you'd think it was weird." "No boys. Weird is keeping your clothes on all the time and not having any fun?" Helen said as she walked to the toilet and sat down facing the wall. The boys followed along and took up positions either side of the bowl. Dawn got into the act as well. She squatted in between the boys and put an arm around each of them for support. "I haven't seen this for ages. I think it was Ollie, late last year," Dawn added, leaving the boys to contemplate the identity of Ollie. Helen urinated first. The assembled throng could easily see the pee falling from the center of Helen's closed flaps. Before it had finished, Helen's anus began to first bulge, then widen out, until finally the first brown lump appeared. A piece of shit, probably 6 inches long and 1 inch plus in diameter, slid from Helen's ass and fell into the bowl. She pulled her ass in and pushed again. Another piece, shorter and narrower. Helen kept pumping her ass in and out until she was sure there was nothing more inside. The audience behind her was totally silent, so she decided to pump her ass a few more times to give them a proper show. Grabbing a handful of toilet paper, she sat up a little and was about to wipe her ass when a tiny voice peeped. "Can I?" It was Mr. Adventure, Vlad. "Okay. But don't wipe any poop into my vagina. Girls are different from boys. We always have to wipe backwards," Helen advised her young charge. "I understand," said the boy as he gently wiped the dregs from Helen's anus. "At home, I get some wet toilet paper and wash Vlad when I want to fuck," Carl added. That is where the bidet comes in. Out of the way, kids," Helen requested, before rising from the toilet and seating herself on the bidet. She turned on the faucet and a small jet of water sprayed along her pussy. She put her hand between her legs and rubbed vagina and ass with her palm. Vlad moved in closer and offered his hand, palm up to Helen. She understood what he wanted and nodded gently. Vlad moved in closer and slid his hand in, rubbing her pussy and anus as she had just done. Pausing for a second to feel the center of her anus with his finger, Helen pushed and opened her ass into his hand. Vlad didn't flinch. Instead he ran his fingers through the flesh and around the rim, making sure that it was all clean. When she figured he had played enough, Helen pulled her ass in and twisted around to shut off the water. Holding his hand to keep him with her, Helen told the group to scatter. Go have a quick swim and then it's on to the playroom. Once Carl and Dawn had disappeared, Helen reached over with her free hand and took hold of the young man's cock. She bent it a little to test its rigidity, then looked the boy straight in the eye. You really liked that last bit, didn't you? Yes, ma'am. Helen released his hand and his cock and the boy raced off to join the others. She flushed the toilet, made sure the bidet was clean, collected the towels from the sauna, then sauntered off behind them. Okay. That's enough of a swim. We were just in here to rinse off, Helen called. She was the first out of the pool, first to collect a towel but not the first to the door of the playroom. Dawn grabbed it on her. She was keen. The boys arrived just before Helen, who closed the door behind herself. The boys were greeted by a room about 20 by 15 feet. Along one wall was a giant flat-screen TV. There were seats and benches of various sizes and heights, some with backs, some without, all with colorful vinyl padding. They turned around and saw there was a small bench and a refrigerator one side of the door they had just passed through and a cupboard on the other. Near the back of the room there another doorway. Vlad turned back and forward a few more times, determined not to ask any questions. He stood there pondering for a while and announced his conclusion. This room is for sex. Clever boy. I knew you would work it out. Helen was pleased. Now come here. So far it's been the boys playing with the girls. Now us girls get a turn. Helen led young Vlad to a vinyl-covered bench about knee height, a bit over 2 feet wide and about 6 feet long. Without speaking, she positioned him in the middle of the bench, face up. His cock stood up from his body like a flagpole. Knowing he would want them free, she laid his arms above his head before mounting him in a 69er position and immediately going down on him. Carl and Dawn watched all this from the sidelines. Wanting some of the same, Dawn simply pointed to a similar bench further into the room. Carl was no dummy. He leapt onto the bench and assumed exactly the same position. Dawn knelt for a moment next to Carl's hip. She grasped his cock tight and pumped it a little, forcing Carl's juice out of his cock and onto her hand. Bringing her face close to his, she gave him the pleasure of watching her lick her hand clean. She wanted to play him a little more. Instead of mounting him as her mother had just done with Vlad, she positioned herself over his face and slowly lowered her pussy toward his mouth. He attempted to lift his head and she pulled away. Once he was laying flat, she started down again. She saw him tension his stomach to lift again, so she withdrew again. He finally realized that the only way he would get the pussy was to wait until it came to him. An excellent lesson, he thought. Once he finally got to do some licking, he felt Dawn lay flat on his stomach and take his cock into her mouth. Back on the first bench, Vlad was having fun. Instead of licking Helen, he was diving into her cunt with all 4 fingers on one hand, and her ass with 2 fingers on the other. Helen was content to slowly blow the boy. With his smaller cock she was able to take his entire penis and squirt him into her mouth. Every now and again she would bend him up and lick down to his anus. Vlad had moved both his hands to her anus, sticking 2 fingers on each side and stretching it wide. She slowly lowered her ass until she started to feel his tongue as well as his fingers. She lowered a little more, leaving room only for his face and her crack. With the fingers removed, her anus closed and she could feel his lips forming a seal around it, tongue still darting around inside. Slowly she pushed her ass open inside his mouth. She heard him squeal a little and his tongue went berserk. His cock went rock hard, so she drew her lips back until only his head remained inside. When she couldn't push her ass out any further, she started working his cock a little harder, sliding his foreskin up and down with just 2 fingers and her thumb. His cum was sweet. She held it in her mouth until he relaxed a little and her ass was back inside. She dismounted and pulled him into a sitting position in front of her. Only then did she open her mouth and revealed the cum inside. Now that she had his complete attention, she closed her mouth and swallowed. He flung himself at her, wrapping his arms around her neck and holding her tight. After a minute or so he relaxed a little and brought his lips to her ear. "Thank you," he whispered. "What for?" Helen liked this game, so played along. For opening your ass in my mouth." There was a quivering in his voice. Helen paused for a second, then pulled him away just enough to be able to look into his eyes. "That's what made you come so fast?" The boy nodded. "Does Carl do that for you?" He nodded again, then dropped his gaze away from her. Lifting his head with a finger under his chin, she asked, "You're not ashamed, are you?" He nodded again before pressing in to hug her neck once more. She found his ear to whisper, "You shouldn't. We will talk about this later, in a session. Okay?" She felt the boy nodding. Dawn and Carl were just finishing. She had her mouth full of cum and he now knew the taste of young orgasm. All four sat for a while and took in the moment. Seeing that Dawn and Carl were looking at them, Helen unwrapped Vlad's arms and sat him down in front of her. "Thank you, young man. That's just what the doctor ordered," Helen let out in a cheery voice. Helen walked to the bench by the door and opened a cupboard underneath. Extracting a couple of packets of crisps, she threw one to each of the boys. "What would you like, darling?" she asked of Dawn. "Same will do." She had barely finished speaking when a packet lobbed in her lap. "And to drink? Coke, Pepsi or some other rot gut?" "Coke, Pepsi," came from the boys. Dawn chimed in with rot gut. "Dawn, instead of being a smartass, how about you come to the fridge and get it? I'm not about to throw cans of drink." For herself, Helen decided on a small packet of cashew nuts and a glass of Riesling. "A big girl drink for me," she thought. Before she returned to the others, she glanced at a telephone at the far corner of the bench. It had a large red light on top that flashed instead of ringing. The display of the telephone also contained the only clock in the room. 2:15. With all the fun they had been having, she guessed it would have been nearly 4 o'clock. Good. As they ate their snacks, Helen thought she would start a little informal therapy session. "Carl, for Dawn's benefit, tell us the first person you had sex with." "Vlad, of course. Until today he was the only person I'd had sex with." "So the answer is, your brother?" "Yes, Vlad." "Who was the first person you had sex with?" "Carl. My brother," he added, knowing that is what Helen was after. "Dawn? How about you?" "The first person I had sex with was Robert Fitzgibbon in 3rd grade." "Dawn. Play the game," Helen chided. "Okay. The first person I had sex with was my brother, Ben. Because it's dumb to ask yourself. Mom. Who popped your cherry?" "Thank you, darling, and you know I hate that expression. But the answer is Angus, my brother." Her drink finished, Helen moved to the far end of the room and rummaged through a drawer unit in the corner, returning with something clutched in her hand. She slapped her hand face down on the end of the bench Dawn and Carl were occupying, lifting it to reveal a quantity of assorted condoms. "Come here, young," she said as she gestured to Vlad. "Boys, you should know what these are." Dawn was about to speak before Helen silenced her with an accusing finger. "Condoms, rubbers," was the mixed reply. "Exactly. Let's just stick to condoms." Helen continued. "Have either of you ever used one?" "No," was the common reply. "Well, now is your big chance. I have hundreds of them hidden around the house, just in case." Helen paused to cast an obvious stare at both boys' penises. "Now I want you to show me what you get up to at home, so if you need a pee or to empty out, now is the time. The bathroom we used before is through there," she concluded, pointing to the door at the far end of the room. The boys jumped up and disappeared through the door, leaving it open as boys are wont to do. Helen shuffled closer to Dawn to have a quiet chat. "The boys are used to having anal sex bareback. As you just heard, they have never used a condom. I was planning to get each of them to try a few different things, all while wearing a condom. First anal sex with their brother, then anal sex with you, and finally vaginal sex. Are you fine with that, darling?" Helen asked of her daughter, and before she could answer, "We can scrap the idea if you aren't comfortable." "No. That's fine. They are cute boys. With their little wieners they won't be any problem physically." Dawn paused a little when she saw her mother's wry smile. Mentally. "You know I have a thing for cute young boys. Last count, it was 3 things, if I know my anatomy," Helen retorted. "Mother." Dawn put on her best, fake, shocked tone. Helen forced a smile from her face to allow herself to talk. "I think we'll do Vlad first. After they have done the comparisons I'll leave Carl with you to finish off. I'm sure I will think of something to keep Vlad happy. Now who has a thing for cute young boys?" Dawn fired back at her mother. Both grinned and leaned forward for a kiss. During the discussion, Helen had been hearing all sorts of chatter and giggles coming from the bathroom. The boys were having fun with the bidet. They finally emerged, cocks bouncing in front of them, as they jostled to be the first one back. Being the larger boy, Carl won? Good. Now Carl, you can go back and close the door ... and don't slam it. Helen went into mother mode. Vlad grinned at the poetic Justice, and just as quickly stifled the grin when he caught Helen's glare. Once Carl had returned, Helen began to explain. Okay boys. You talked about some of the things you do together when we had the first session. Now you can show me some. She paused a little to see their reactions, then continued. First off, we need to make sure those cocks of yours are nice and hard, so how about you show me how you both suck each other at the same time? Then pointing to a padded, hip-height bench, right here will do. The boys glanced at each other in another silent conversation, then, without comment or complaint, they climbed on the bench and slid into a 69er position where each was laying on his side. Within a few seconds each boy had wrapped his upper hand around the other's ass and was happily sucking his brother's penis. Helen noted that both boys were playing with the other's anus with their fingers and that both boys were able to take the full length of the other's cock into their mouth. She also noticed that Dawn had noticed. She let them continue for no more than a minute before speaking again. Okay. That's enough of that. We don't want you coming too soon. Sit up and I'll explain what's next. The boys broke apart and sat, side by side, on the edge of the bench, facing Helen. Taking a condom in one hand and holding it aloft, she spoke. Each of you, one at a time, is going to put one of these on. Then I want you to have sex with your brother and you both get to tell me if it feels any different. Then the fun really starts. Helen paused to add a little to the boys' anticipation. Then, Dawn will graciously allow you to have sex with her. Helen paused again as the boys looked quickly at each, then returned their attention to her as she continued to speak. Next, I want you to have anal sex with Dawn and tell me what that feels like and whether it feels any different from your brother. Dawn has had plenty of anal sex, so she knows what to expect. Isn't that right, darling? Helen concluded, inviting Dawn to speak. Yeah. Mom is right. I have it both ways, but I still like it in my pussy the most. Dawn replied. And that is precisely what will happen next. Once you have tried Dawn's backside, you can see what it feels like in her beautiful, tight, pink vagina. Helen said in a tone reminiscent of carnival hawker. Then she quickly added ... but the condom is a must. Dawn is too young for the pill, so the condom is the only thing that is stopping babies. Get it? Both boys nodded. Vlad. I've decided you are first. Come and sit right in front of me. Carl, you can watch from the side. Once the boy was in position, Helen proceeded to show them the correct method for applying the condom. To make sure the boy's member was fully rigid, she allowed herself the pleasure of a quick suck. Soon Vlad was sitting there with his flagpole sporting a pretty pink sheath. Now, the other thing with condoms is that Vlad's juice is now stuck inside, so it won't be able to lubricate Carl's ass. She went on. So, we'll need something else. Carl. I think we will do this testing in the same position, so I want you up on the bench on your hands and knees. Helen continued giving orders. Once Carl was in position, Helen proceeded to lubricate his ass. Once again, she allowed herself a little pleasure as she gave the boy's anus a good fingering. Right-o, Vlad. You know what to do. Helen finished her words with a flourish. Vlad moved in behind his older brother, and with little ceremony, drove his cock deep into the other boy's anus. The ladies watched as he took hold of Carl's hips and gave his brother a fairly vigorous fucking. They watched as Vlad's pink shaft slid in and out of Carl's tight, wet ass, his thighs slapping into his brother's butt cheeks. In the middle of it all, Helen ventured a question to either or both. How's the condom feel? I can feel. Any difference? Carl answered, his sentence interrupted by Vlad's cock driving home. With his cock deep in his brother's ass, Vlad paused for a second to answer. A little different, but I think that's the extra juice. Helen let them fuck a little longer before again interrupting. Okay. Now try Dawn's ass. Eager to stick his cock into someone new, and a girl at that, Vlad backed away from Carl but stayed kneeling on the bench. Helen wiped Carl's ass with a tissue and helped him from the bench. Dawn jumped up and immediately took up the same position. Handing the bottle to Carl, Helen remarked. Perhaps you would like to lube up Dawn? The boy grinned as he took the bottle. He dribbled a little in the crack of Dawn's ass, and as it ran down over her anus, the young man took extra delight in making sure it was spread deep inside. Do I need to do her vagina as well? He asked. Unsure. Helen was pleased to use the correct term but a little disappointed that he seemed to forget the pussy licking he gave her earlier. No. Dawn makes her own lube in there. I seem to remember you tasting it earlier. Carl blushed at his own stupidity. Well? What are you waiting for? Ask first. Helen motioned for Vlad to get on with it. He was used to his brother but didn't know what to expect with Dawn, so Vlad pushed slowly at first as his cock started to disappear inside Dawn. Carl watched from just inches away, knowing he would get his turn soon. Vlad pumped slowly for the first 5 or 6 strokes, then got into it. Soon his thighs were slapping into Dawn's butt just as hard as they had with Carl. Eager to know, it was Carl who asked the question. Well? With his cock deep in Dawn, Vlad paused. A little different. Hard to explain. I'll explain later. Helen interjected. But for now, note that the entrance should feel just as tight and a little less tight deep inside. Yeah. That's it. Vlad added as he resumed his first ass fuck of a girl. Yeah. Again to reinforce it, as he pushed in deep and hard. Okay. Stop. As I said, I don't want you coming yet. Helen commanded. Back away from that ass. She added jokingly. The boys giggled. Helen quickly inspected the boy's cock to make sure there are no brown stains, before continuing. Okay, now the pussy. I'll give you a bit more time, but I still don't want you to come. Okay? Vlad nodded as Helen spoke. Again, Carl's face was just inches away as Vlad slid his cock into Dawn. He pushed it all the way in and pumped a few times. He thought this feels a lot like her ass. Then Dawn started to flex the muscles inside her vagina, grabbing the boy's cock. Dawn had been fucking for only 2 years, but she was skilled. She had been taught by the best. Oh? Fuck. Vlad's final thoughts escaped for all to hear. Don't make him come, young lady. Helen chided. Dawn turned her pussy down a notch. Okay, mommy. Helen let the pair fuck for a few more minutes. Dawn gently went back to full speed inside her tight little cunt, and Vlad felt it. He kept his mouth shut this time and enjoyed the ride. Carl just kept staring. Helen could see the juice flowing down his rigid cock, over his scrotum and drip onto the floor below. She was unsure who was closer to orgasm, Vlad or Carl. Enough. In her quiet but commanding tone. Vlad pumped a few more times before she followed up with Vlad. Once they finally parted, she spoke again. I know that was hard to stop. I'm sure you would have liked to finish off, but I have other plans and I'm certain Carl would like a turn. Carl? Oh, yes please. Dawn didn't wait for her mother to try and wipe her clean. She jumped off the bench, content for her pussy to be as wet as it was. Patting the bench with one hand she spoke. Okay Vlad. Hands and knees please. And to Carl, I know you must be desperate to go straight to stage 3, but I want you to do all 3 just like Vlad. That means a little brotherly love first. Okay? Carl nodded. Helen tossed the lube bottle to Dawn as Carl climbed onto the bench. He watched as she applied the lube, adding a second and then third finger to stretch Vlad's tight anus a little. Carl was about to mount his brother when Helen lifted a condom in front of his face. Forgetting something? Looking embarrassed, Carl took the packet, fumbling a little as he tore it open, then slid the rubber down his shaft before looking questioningly at Helen. Yes, that's correct. It appears you were watching when I did Vlad. Now, are you going to fuck that boy or just kneel there showing us your pretty pink cock? Her tone was light. She was just egging him on, not really serious. Carl knew the ass in front of him well. He moved in and drove his cock into Vlad hard. Helen might have been worried had she not seen the vigorous way Vlad had fucked Carl's face in her office. They are both young and strong and, as she was coming to understand, they played hard with each other. Carl fucked his brother for a while, leaning over him and driving in deep. He stopped and withdrew his cock before Helen had spoken again. Okay. Vlad was right. The condom doesn't make much difference. The extra slipperiness is nice though. What about you Vlad? Same. Vlad replied. What I think is that you are eager to try out Dawn's pussy. What do you think Dawn? Was that the quickest boy fuck you've ever seen? Perhaps we should get him to do the first test over again. Helen was teasing the poor boy. His balls were about to burst just thinking of what must have made Vlad say. Dawn played along. No. I think he passed that test okay. Shove over Vlad. I want to see if he can fuck my ass that hard. Vlad rolled off one side of the bench as Dawn climbed on from the other. Before getting into the all fours position she put her hand between her legs, pushed all 4 fingertips into her pussy, scooped out some juice before smearing it over her anus. Carl was loving this. Helen moved in behind Vlad, who was standing by the side, directly in front of the action. As he stood there, she took a tissue and wiped the lube from his ass. He wouldn't need that anymore today. She wrapped her arms around him, her breasts pushed tight against his back. Carl moved in and made a beeline for Dawn's anus. He held his cock against her hole for a second, her puckered flesh pushed in until it was smooth. He hovered there while to take in the moment. Girl ass. He pushed in gently without pause, until the tight ring of her anus was wrapped around the base of his shaft. Again he hovered for a moment, looking down at the thick bead of the condom. Fantastic. Like Vlad before, he started pumping slowly, but not for long. Soon he was bent over her, ramming his cock into her ass as hard as he could. Vlad, watching from the side, was a little surprised at the ferocity of it all, and turned away. Helen noticed. "Okay, young man. Take a break before you go on to stage 3. She called. "You young ones can get fully energetic." Carl backed away and fell onto 2 heels, knees spread, his cock pointing to the ceiling. Dawn slumped to one side. She wasn't affected by the strength of the fucking. She was just getting sick of the doggy position. Still, she had happily endured longer sessions with Ben, so this wasn't so bad. Before they recommenced, Helen put in a word. "Alright, young man. A little training. Fucking is not all about who can shove it in the hardest. So when you get started with stage 3, don't go hard at it the whole time. Go gently for some of it and let Dawn show you what she can do. Okay?" Carl nodded. Dawn jumped in when she was sure her mother had finished. "And we'll only do it a little bit this way 'cause I'm getting sick of kneeling." So Dawn moved down to her hands and knees once more and Carl rose behind her. Vlad watched as Carl entered the juicy cunt that he had fucked just a few minutes earlier. He could see Dawn's vulva pushed apart by the rod being pushed between them, her labia stretched and pulled as the shaft slid in and out. He looked up, and from the contortions of Carl's face he figured that Dawn was doing her trick with her vagina. Helen was watching Vlad's face. This time he was much happier. She moved in behind him and hugged him again. She reached down and took hold of his cock, still in its sheath, and gave it a few pumps. Hard as a rock. Enough. It was Dawn. "My knees are killing me." Reluctantly Carl dropped back onto his heels. As soon as his cock was free, Dawn dropped back on one side again. Helen straightened, but kept one arm around Vlad. "So what do you two think? Are we girls worth having around?" she asked. "Yeah. You bet," the 2 boys answered. "And are you glad we have vaginas?" Both boys just grinned. "Dawn, how about you find another way to teach Carl some tricks? Any ideas?" "Meister," Dawn replied without a second thought. The boys had no idea what that meant, but Helen did. "Okay. You take Carl off and show him what you mean. I'll see if I can find some way to keep young Vladimir amused." Vlad and Helen sat and watched while Dawn led Carl to an odd contraption at the back of the room. The boys had seen it when they first entered but were afraid to ask what it was. At Dawn's direction, Carl hoisted her up so she was sitting, her ass at hip height, facing him. Dawn leaned back and lifted her legs, one at a time, into stirrups on either side. Now the boys got it. Dawn could just sit there, her pussy at the same height as Carl's cock, and have him fuck her. Cool. But who or what was my? Vlad wondered. Helen put an arm around her young charge and began. "What did you really think about being inside Dawn? Did you really like it?" "Oh yes." "What did she do with her vagina?" Helen reached in with her free hand and took hold of the boy's cock with her fingers flattened. "She can move her muscles to squeeze your cock like this." And Helen squeezed his cock as she spoke. "I'm sorry I made you stop. I could see that your balls were about to burst." She paused for just half a second. "And I didn't want you to come inside her. My balls are still about to burst. Do I get another chance after Carl?" "No, silly," she said as she leaned across and kissed him on the cheek. "You're all mine." Then as she stripped the condom from his rigid cock, "Now fuck me." Vlad looked her in the face, eyes wide, incredulous. She answered the million questions he was firing at her by simply nodding. It took a while for it to sink in. Slowly she leaned back until she was flat on her back, pulling the young man with her as she went. She spread her legs as he mounted her, his naked cock slipping effortlessly into her dripping wet cunt. They paused for a second or two, his cock deep inside her, his stomach flat on hers. She held his head on either side and lifted his face to look directly at her, You are a very special young man and I want you to come inside me. Thank you. Helen got that his reply was not connected to what she had just said, so decided to play the game. What for? I'll tell you later. And with this, the young man started to fuck, gently at first, then hard. With each stroke he forced Helen's legs apart further. Soon Helen was forced to lift her legs, and with that the young man lifted himself into the press-up position. Helen recalled that this was the position Vlad was in when he first came inside Carl. Once he had her there, Vlad changed his pace, allowing her to use the muscles in her vagina. From the inside she massaged his cock and milked his juice into herself. Now it was her turn to change the pace. She wrapped her legs around his ass, something that Carl had never done, and with every stroke she pushed his ass down into her. He could feel his balls slapping against her ass with every downbeat. He heard her breathing change, and guessed that she must have been an orgasm. It was more than the boy's balls could take. He stopped pumping, and held tight against her as he filled her cunt with cream. Dawn and Carl had finished minutes earlier, about the time that Helen had wrapped her legs around Vlad. Carl stood, mesmerized, by the show, a cum-filled condom still adorning his waning cock. Dawn was no better, still sitting in the chair, legs spread side. Both were a little surprised by the intensity of the fuck they had just witnessed. Vlad had been motionless, cock pressed deep into Helen, for some time before Dawn broke the silence. "Help me down," she asked of Carl. Carl lifted her legs from the stirrups and held her waist as she pushed off from the chair. Her legs had gone to sleep a little, so she used an arm around Carl's shoulders to help her stand. The noise jogged Vladimir from the trance that held him. He lifted himself out of Helen and plonked his ass on the seat where her feet should be. As Helen slowly brought her legs together and lowered them, Vlad pointed to Carl and laughed. His penis had deflated substantially and the condom, cum-pooled at the tip, hung off him like dripping snot. Dawn came to his rescue, grabbing the rubber by the open end and pulling it the last few inches off his cock. With Vlad sitting where he was, Helen could not put her legs together. She lowered them, one behind his ass, the other resting on his lap. When he turned around to look at her, he could see, between her partially open legs, a pool of cum filling the crack of her ass. His cum. As he watched, she squeezed and more cum flowed out of the mouth of her vagina and into the pool. The other two saw it as well as they came closer. They were speechless. "Into the pool," Helen called. Dawn and Carl made for the door, pausing only to allow Dawn to deposit the condom in a waste bin. Helen was slower to rise. She had been mightily fucked by this young man and she knew it. He waited to help her to her feet and, seeing the pool of cum on the bench, looked at her in bewilderment. "It's okay. We can clean it up later. That's why all the seats are covered in vinyl." As she moved away from the bench, he looked at the cum covering her ass and sliding down the insides of her legs. "And that's why we're heading for the pool," she added, seeing him looking at her ass. Before they left the room she paused. "Thank you for what?" She was referring back to the conversation just before they fucked. Vlad looked at her for a moment, thinking of exactly the right words. "Thank you for choosing me to go first." And then, by way of explanation, that way Dawn and Carl would be together at the end. He paused. "And you'd have me. You did that on purpose. You are a very special young man. And thank you." "What for?" The game continued. "For a magic moment.